Have you ever felt like a burden in the lives of the people you love the most? Claire did. She felt it deeply, in the middle of a street in Lisbon, with her suitcases still unpacked and her children's eyes filled with frustration. At 65, after dedicating her entire life to motherhood, to her home, to the stability of others, she discovered that, to her children, her presence had become inconvenient. And it wasn't said gently. It was shouted. It was cruel. And it was final. Abandonment is a heavy word. But is there anything more brutal than being left behind without a passport, without a ticket, without a plan, only with your own thoughts hammering away at what went wrong? This story is not just about a mother left alone in a foreign country. It is about a rebirth. About the kind of transformation that only happens when everything collapses. Claire could have curled up, surrendered to despair. But instead, she decided to rise again. And the most surprising part? This turning point began the very moment she realized she no longer needed anyone's permission to be happy. This narrative will take you down unexpected paths of resilience, emotional independence, and liberation, and it will make you rethink relationships, boundaries, and the true meaning of caring for yourself. Prepare yourself to witness the rebirth of a woman who discovered, late in life, that there was still so much left to live and that maybe, abandonment had been the greatest gift disguised as tragedy. Lisbon was warm that afternoon, but all Claire could feel was the chill running down her spine. The sun cast gold across the rooftops of the city, tourists laughed in the streets, and there, in the middle of a crowded square, everything inside her collapsed. Shane and Jack, her grown sons, were shouting. It wasn't an ordinary argument, it was a rupture. Their words cut deeper than knives. You ruin everything. We can't take it anymore. This wasn't just a family quarrel. It was the unveiling of something that had been fermenting for years, and Claire, at 65, with a heart already broken so many times, was forced to face a painful truth to her sons: she was the problem. She was the burden. And in that instant, she felt abandonment pierce her like a blade driven deep. It had all started with little friction, sand offhand comment here, a sharp reply there. Claire, like so many mothers, still carried the role of caretaker, trying to hold everyone together, happy, in harmony. But time does not forgive illusions. Her sons were now men, with their own lives, their own wounds she could no longer reach. They didn't want advice anymore, nor affection, much less reminders of the past. What they wanted was distance. Motherhood, once her greatest source of identity, now seemed to be the root of conflict. And that day in Lisbon, in the middle of a vacation she herself had planned, everything exploded. Jack was the first to rise from the cafe table. He shoved his chair back, his eyes burning. You don't respect our space. Shane followed. We've been trying, but you always ruin the moment. Claire tried to understand. She tried to reason. But their words carried the weight of a sentence. It wasn't just anger. It was finality. She didn't realize it at the time, but that scene wasn't merely a tantrum. It was goodbye. And the cruelest part? They had planned it. Every word, every restrained reaction, all of it pointed to a decision already made. Her sons had chosen to leave her there, alone, without support. The world spun around her, but for Claire everything froze. The sound of trams, of laughter, of Portuguese voices in the background, all of it turned into meaningless noise. She looked at her sons, searching for the little boys she had once raised, fed, and held through fevers at night. But there was no tenderness in their eyes. Only resentment. Only hurt. You're suffocating, Mom. You never think of anyone else. It felt like a slap in public. For the first time, Claire wondered if she had been wrong all along. If the love she gave had been a cage in disguise. If her gestures of care had, over time, turned into control. Nothing made sense in that moment, except the pain burning through her chest. Without realizing, tears streamed down her face. But Claire didn't scream, didn't beg. She just stood there, frozen, as Shane and Jack walked away. The abandonment wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, excruciating. Each step they took toward the exit felt like a nail hammered into her soul. The table remained littered with half-empty glasses, untouched plates, and a deafening silence. The waiters pretended not to see. The tourists carried on with their routes. And Claire, caught between the past that had defined her and the present that rejected her, understood something had died right there. Something deep. And there would be no return. Her mind rewound to the past like a disordered film. Shane's birth, Jack's drawings at 5 years old, Christmas mornings, Saturday soccer games. All of it felt distant now, as though it belonged to another woman. A woman who still believed motherhood was enough. That a mother's love could keep her children close forever. Reality was different. Claire was alone. And the most unexpected part? For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do. She had always had a plan. She had always led, organized, protected. But there, in the heart of Lisbon, she was just another invisible, wounded woman searching for meaning. Night fell slowly, and with it came emptiness. Claire tried calling her sons. Their phones were turned off. She sent messages, no reply. She went back to the hotel, only to discover the reservation had been cancelled. Confused, she asked the receptionist for help. With a look of discomfort, he handed her an envelope. Inside, a short note: "We need some time. Don't try to find us." And along with it, a terrifying detail: her passport and her return ticket were gone. This was abandonment in its most ruthless form, meticulous, premeditated, absolute. At 65, Claire had been discarded like unwanted baggage. She sat in the lobby, staring at the envelope in her hands. The shock of abandonment still didn't have a name. It was a mixture of rage, pain, humiliation, and something else: release. For the first time, Claire was free of every role she had ever carried. She was not a mother, not a wife, not a caretaker. She was just herself. Alone. And without knowing it, that was the very first spark of what would become her rebirth. Because when everything shatters, what remains is space. And sometimes, space is exactly what we need to rebuild. Waking up in an empty hotel room was strange enough. But waking up with the suffocating certainty that something was terribly wrong, that was unbearable. Claire opened her eyes slowly, expecting to hear footsteps, voices, any sound that suggested her sons were still nearby. But all she found was silence, heavy and mocking. On the nightstand, next to a half-full glass of water, lay the same note from the day before. Only now, reality struck with brutal clarity: this wasn't a misunderstanding. She had truly been abandoned. Alone. Without warning. Without preparation. Without a passport. The first hours were filled with denial. Claire checked her emails, the airline app, her call history. Nothing. No message, no sign of regret. When she accessed the airline system, her heart nearly stopped. Her return flight had been cancelled. Not postponed. Cancelled. And no other ticket existed in her name. Claire felt the world tilt beneath her feet. How could her own children take such a radical step? They had taken her passport, erased her traces, eliminated every possibility of immediate return. It was as if they had erased her existence from the family equation. She paced around the room as though searching for remnants of herself. Slippers by the bed, a toothbrush, a shirt draped over the chair, small traces that reminded her she had once belonged to something. Now she didn't anymore. The cruelty of abandonment wasn't just in the solitude. It was in the unspoken message: you are no longer welcome. Claire had always believed that, despite arguments, blood ties were unbreakable. But there, in another continent, without documents and without a voice, that belief crumbled. This wasn't a miscommunication. It was a deliberate cut, deep and irreversible. The kind of wound that leaves a scar forever. She sat at the edge of the bed, her phone in her hand. She thought of calling someone. But who? The life she had left in the United States was made of fragile connections: former co-workers, distant neighbors, a few friends more out of convenience than true closeness. There was no real support network. Her marriage to Robert, her ex-husband, had been buried years ago. And those motherhood friendships? They had all dissolved over time, as her children grew up. Claire faced a painful paradox. She had been everything to everyone and now she was nothing to anyone. Loneliness tasted like rust. Looking out the hotel window, watching the trams go by as the city carried on indifferently, Claire was struck by a disconcerting feeling: freedom. But not the kind of freedom she had once dreamed about. This was the freedom of abandonment. The absence of ties, of duties, of direction. Still, somewhere deep inside, a seed had been planted. What if this was the moment to start over? Not by choice, but by life's brutal imposition. Claire didn't know what to do, but something inside her, perhaps the voice buried under decades of motherhood, began to whisper, "You are still alive. And for now, that's enough." She walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at her reflection. She hadn't really looked at herself in years. The gray strands of hair, once hidden under rushed dye jobs, now carried a strange dignity. The wrinkles around her eyes weren't ugly. They were maps. Stories lived. Claire pressed her hands to her face, feeling simultaneously exhausted and awakened. What do I do now? The answer rose from her instincts: seek help. Go to the embassy. Try to recover her documents. Begin again, even if stumbling in the dark. Because when everything is taken from you, every small step becomes an act of courage. The walk to the embassy felt like one of the longest journeys of her life. Not because of the distance, but because of the emotional weight. Each step on Lisbon's sidewalks was a confrontation with reality. The streets that just yesterday had witnessed family photos and laughter were now the stage of her unexpected abandonment. Claire walked with the dignity of someone still trying to understand where she had gone wrong. And her mind, restless, revisited every moment of the past years, trying to spot the signs she had ignored. Had she smothered her children with too much care? Had motherhood, lived in its full intensity, turned into a prison for them? When she finally saw the American flag waving at the top of the building, Claire felt something stir in her chest. Fear, yes, but also determination. Reaching the embassy wasn't just a logistical step. It was symbolic. It was the moment when, for the first time in decades, she was acting for herself, without waiting for anyone's approval. The sting of abandonment was still raw. It would hurt for a long time. But the decision to react, to refuse to accept the role of victim, was born right there. And that first step, trembling and solitary, would be the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, but one day, she would call rebirth. The interior of the American embassy was cold, bureaucratic, full of people rushing around with folders and documents. Claire walked in with her eyes lowered, feeling out of place. The sensation was strange. For the first time in decades, she wasn't a mother, she wasn't a wife, she wasn't a hostess, she was just a lost citizen in the system. She expected compassion, but what she received was a dry, technical kind of service. Still, she pressed on. She needed a new passport. She needed to fix her situation. But more than that, she needed to figure out what to do with what was left of her. The wound of abandonment still bled, but it also sparked something she couldn't quite name. An impulse. A restless stirring. While waiting to be called, she observed the people around her. Young backpackers, couples arguing over itineraries, employees moving quickly from desk to desk. And there she was, 65 years old, alone, invisible, sitting on a plastic chair. Part of her wanted to cry. Another part, quieter, almost forgotten, was beginning to wake up. What if this crisis was, in truth, a chance for transformation? The thought was painful, but also undeniable. Claire realized she didn't want to return to the way things had been before. The monotonous routine, the emotional dependence on her children, the constant feeling that her only worth was in what she provided for others. For the first time, she dared to imagine, what if this was liberation disguised as tragedy? On her phone screen, she opened the photos from the trip. Images from the first days, with forced smiles and distant stares. The truth had been there all along. Her sons didn't want to be there with her. They had come out of obligation, out of guilt. Claire realized she had spent years clinging to bonds that had already unraveled. That she had insisted on being part of a structure that no longer existed. and that this insistence had only pushed her children further away. It was a brutal realization, but necessary. Healing never begins with a grand gesture. It begins with the honest acceptance that something is over. And little by little, Claire was beginning to accept it. When her number was finally called, relief and dread mixed together. She explained her situation with as much dignity as she could, though inside she was trembling. When the attendant asked her to wait for the office that handled vulnerable citizens, Claire felt a sharp sting of shame. But another voice inside her whispered, "You are not less for asking for help. You are more." It was a new thought. A powerful one. After all, why had women of her generation been taught to suffer in silence? To depend emotionally on others to feel valid? Motherhood had swallowed her identity for decades. But now, something else was trying to be born. The wait was long, but not empty. Each minute in that impersonal space became a lesson in self-awareness. Claire took out an old recycled paper notebook she had carried since college, but rarely used. She began scribbling thoughts, fragmented phrases, memories. The simple act of writing worked like an anchor, a way of reconnecting. And between those crooked lines appeared a sentence that made her shiver, "Maybe I need myself more than I need anyone else." That was the moment she understood the rediscovery she had avoided for so long was not just inevitable, it was her only way forward. And perhaps, her greatest gift. In the middle of this reflection, a name appeared on the embassy system screen: Margaret. A refined woman with gray hair and a warm smile, she introduced herself as the head of the support unit. She listened to Claire with rare attention. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't try to minimize the pain. She simply listened. And after hearing everything, she said, "You have more courage than you realize. You just need to believe it." That sentence, spoken so naturally, landed like an explosion inside Claire. She didn't know it yet, but that encounter would become the turning point. Because Margaret wasn't just offering help, she was offering a new path. Before leaving the room, Claire took a deep breath and whispered a thank you. For the first time since everything had begun, she felt something she had nearly forgotten: hope. Not naive hope, but a real spark, grounded in action. She was determined to take the next step, even without knowing where it would lead. Transformation had already begun, quietly. Claire realized that freedom doesn't come when everything is resolved. It comes when you accept the chaos and choose to move forward anyway. At 65, in Lisbon, in a colorless, ordinary room, she made her choice. She would no longer define herself by other people's rejection. As she left the embassy, armed with basic instructions and a vital contact number, Claire noticed the world around her with slightly different eyes. The sidewalks no longer seemed so threatening. The sky looked clearer. The sting of abandonment was still there, but it no longer defined her. It was simply the ground on which she would begin planting her new story. And though she had no concrete plan, not even the certainty of where she would sleep the following week, she carried something far more powerful: courage. True independence begins this way, with timid steps, in unexpected places, and with a quiet determination to choose yourself above all else. Margaret had the kind of presence that didn't need effort to be noticed. She was a woman in her early 60s, but there was a spark in her eyes that Claire hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. She wore a colorful scarf around her neck and moved with a lightness that contrasted with the stiffness of the diplomatic environment. "We can talk over there, more calmly," she suggested, pointing toward a glass-walled room at the back of the embassy. Claire followed without hesitation. She no longer expected much from life at that moment, but there was something comforting about this woman. Something that suggested there might still be space for a new beginning. As soon as they sat down, Margaret offered her tea. "It's part of the ritual. Tea always helps clear the mind." Claire managed a faint smile, accepting the gesture. In the minutes that followed, she recounted her story between long pauses and heavy breaths. For the first time, she was heard without rush. Margaret wasn't just a government worker. She seemed to see beyond the pain. "You are not alone," she said firmly. "And more importantly, you still have choices." The sentence, spoken with such natural strength, felt like a gentle push toward transformation. Claire felt, almost physically, the weight of emotional dependence begin to loosen. As they talked, Margaret explained that she had helped other women in similar situations before. Each story was unique, but the feeling was always the same: abandonment. But sometimes, abandonment is the push we need to finally see ourselves clearly, she said. Claire remained silent for a moment. The phrase echoed like thunder inside her. Painful, yes, but true. Margaret went further. She shared contacts, suggested alternative routes, and finally presented an unexpected opportunity. A vineyard in Spain was looking for someone to help with tourism and guest reception. It was temporary work, yes, but it was also a chance for rebirth. Claire hesitated. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm capable of starting something new now. Margaret smiled softly. You don't need to know. You just need to try. One step at a time. That conversation wasn't just advice, it was an embrace she hadn't received in years. A signal that independence was closer than she thought. The job at the vineyard was simple: greeting visitors, helping with small guided tours, practicing languages. Nothing overly technical, but enough to rebuild her self-worth. Claire, who had spent a lifetime giving herself to others, now had a chance to dedicate herself to herself. Even if only for a while. The thought of leaving Lisbon still seemed terrifying, but the idea started to grow. Spain wasn't that far. And working at a vineyard, there was something poetic about it. Grapes endure pressure, heat, and time before transforming into wine. Wasn't that the perfect metaphor for her own life? Margaret noticed the new light in Claire's eyes and knew she had planted a seed. You deserve this experience, she said gently. And if it doesn't work out, you can come back here. But at least give it a chance. For the first time since her abandonment, Claire felt a spark of excitement. It wasn't about the job itself. It was about putting herself back in motion. In the following days, Claire returned to the embassy to settle paperwork. Margaret continued to encourage her along the way. They took your passport, but they didn't take your essence. Claire laughed whenever she heard that. It was light-hearted, but deeply true. Margaret also helped with local contacts, transportation tips, even suggestions for where to stay during her first days in Spain. That practical support, combined with emotional encouragement, made Claire feel less alone. And more than that, seen. And when you begin to feel seen, you start remembering who you really are. And from there, everything can change. On the day she boarded the bus to Spain, Claire said goodbye to Margaret with a long, heartfelt hug. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Margaret squeezed her hand and replied, when you get there, remember, good wine takes time. And you're only at the beginning of your fermentation. Claire laughed through watery eyes. She was afraid, yes. But now, fear came with a new companion: curiosity. The unknown, once terrifying, now felt like an open door. And even without knowing what she would find on the other side, she chose to walk through it. After all, the first step toward true transformation is the courage to leave the familiar behind. On the road toward the new town, watching the landscape shift outside the bus window, Claire realized abandonment had transformed into propulsion. It was as if every loss had carved out space for something greater. She didn't know if the vineyard would accept her, or if she would manage in the new job. But she knew one thing: she never wanted to go back to the version of herself who needed her children's or her ex-husband's validation to feel alive. This journey wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. A movement toward freedom. And as the green fields of Spain came into view, Claire finally whispered to herself, I still can. I deserve to begin again. The road leading to the vineyard curved gently between rolling hills covered in endless rows of vines. Claire stared out the taxi window, trying to absorb this new world. When the car stopped in front of an old wooden sign that read Quinta del Sol, her heart began to race. This was real. She was here. Not as a tourist, not as a mother tagging along with someone else's plans, but as the protagonist of her own story. Penny, the owner of the vineyard, was waiting at the entrance with an open smile and arms ready for an embrace. She was a vibrant woman, her voice firm, her eyes alive with curiosity and warmth. You must be Claire? I'm so glad you made it. We've been needing someone like you. The impact of those words was immediate. Someone like me? Claire hadn't felt useful in such a long time. But Penny didn't hesitate. Someone with history, with experience, with eyes that see beyond the rush of things. The vineyard was smaller than Claire had imagined, but enchanting. A rustic farmhouse with pale stone walls, a simple garden, and a breathtaking view of the valley. The air smelled of wood, wine, and damp earth, blending into an atmosphere that felt both raw and welcoming. Penny led her inside, showing her the modest but comfortable room she would stay in, and then introduced her to the rhythm of the house. Everything here was done in cooperation. Everyone had a role. And even though Claire was still insecure, she could already sense she had one too. The next morning, she woke early. The sky was still soft with the first light of dawn when she stepped into the garden holding a steaming cup of coffee. She inhaled deeply. Freedom smelled like wet earth and fresh air. Penny soon appeared, handing her a list of light tasks, greeting visitors, organizing small appointments, tending to details in the guest area. Nothing complicated, but enough to awaken in Claire the memory of her own capabilities. Her fluency in English helped. Her attentive way of listening helped even more. Slowly, she was becoming essential to the visitors' experience, captivating them with her calm voice and the gentle way she shared stories. Each day brought something new. A group of Italians who communicated mostly with hand gestures. An elderly Englishwoman who wanted to know everything about red wines. A Brazilian couple who insisted on taking dozens of pictures at sunset. And Claire realized something remarkable: her life experience wasn't baggage to hide. It was an advantage. Motherhood had trained her to comfort, to improvise, to read silences. And now, for the first time in years, she was valued not for what she could give others, but for who she truly was. The simple rhythm of the vineyard became a balm. Day by day, brick by brick, she was rebuilding herself. The vineyard was no longer just a refuge, it became a mirror, reflecting back a new version of herself. And the most beautiful part? She started laughing again. Real laughter. The kind that rises from the chest, that comes unannounced, unashamed. The kind of laughter that belongs to someone slowly being reborn. In the quiet evenings, Claire would sit and write in her notebook. Not as an act of desperation anymore, but as a ritual of recording small joys. Phrases said by tourists. Details she would have ignored before. Tiny, ordinary moments that now felt extraordinary. Words like transformation and freedom appeared again and again between her paragraphs. Claire was sleeping well now. Eating better. Walking between the vineyards as if she finally belonged somewhere. There was no luxury here. But there was peace. A peace that came from within. A peace no plane ticket in the world could buy. With time, Claire began to get more involved. She helped Penny organize small events, wrote short texts to promote vineyard visits, and gave tourists simple tips about the local wines. She felt useful again. And this was the essence of true healing, not the kind that comes from grand dramatic gestures, but the kind that grows day by day, brick by brick, through presence and constancy. The vineyard became more than a workplace, it turned into a mirror in which Claire saw herself with new eyes. And the most surprising change was the laughter. She laughed again, without guilt, without needing permission. Laughter that came from deep inside her chest, as if something long dormant had finally been awakened. In the quiet nights, she filled her notebook with words that no longer resembled laments but rather records of her rebirth. She wrote about the smell of wine barrels, about the sunlight falling across the hills, about the unexpected kindness of strangers. She no longer wrote only about pain, she wrote about discovery. The word transformation repeated itself often, as did freedom. Claire now slept peacefully. She ate with appetite, something she hadn't done in years. She walked slowly through the vineyards, feeling, for the first time in a long time, that she truly belonged somewhere. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't grandeur. But it was peace. A peace that rose from within, a peace no airline ticket, no carefully planned vacation, could ever provide. Penny noticed the change. You look different, Claire. More alive. More in control of yourself. Claire smiled, a little shy. I think I needed to stop trying to be everything for everyone. Penny nodded in agreement. That's the trap for so many of us. We forget how to live for ourselves. The conversation lingered in the air, like the aroma of aged wine rising from the barrels. Claire, in silence, knew at this place, these people, this new routine, they were rescuing what she had buried for years. The independence she had never dared to live. The woman she had always postponed, for the sake of others. One late afternoon, sitting under the shade of an olive tree, Claire looked at the horizon and whispered to herself, I may not have everything figured out. But now, I have myself. And there, between the hum of cicadas and the scent of ripe grapes, she understood motherhood was a beautiful part of her story, but it wasn't all of it. Abandonment had been the portal. Rebirth, the crossing. And what would come next? She didn't know. But for the first time, that didn't bring fear. It brought curiosity. Because when you rediscover yourself at 65, every day becomes an unexpected invitation to live again. It was on a cloudy afternoon that Claire saw him. At first, she thought it was a mirage, maybe a reflection of an old memory or a trick of a nostalgic mind. But no. It was real. Robert, her ex-husband, walking slowly through the vineyards, like someone searching without knowing exactly what they were hoping to find. Claire froze. Her hands turned clammy. Her heart raced. She hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years. And now, here he was, in the very place where she was finally starting to rebuild, the past appearing as unexpectedly as it was unsettling. She didn't know if she should run, cry, or simply vanish. Robert saw her and waved timidly. The same smile that had once enchanted her. The same look of a man who had always known how to use sweet words to avoid hard conversations. Claire took a deep breath and walked toward him. The conversation was strange, too polite for two people who had once shared a life. The boys told me you were here, he said. They were worried. Claire felt a bitter mixture of irony and sadness. Worried now? After the abandonment? But she chose not to answer that. Not here. The reunion with her ex-husband was a test of her new independence. A reminder of who she had been and of who she no longer wanted to be. They sat on a stone bench near the lavender garden. Robert spoke in that conciliatory tone he always used when he wanted to avoid conflict. I think we were all exhausted, Claire. The boys, me, you. None of us knew how to handle it anymore. Claire listened in silence. His words didn't strike her the way they once did. Not because they didn't hurt, but because she had already begun to heal. Robert continued, I came because I felt I needed to understand. I needed to see you. For the first time, Claire looked at him with clarity. She saw his flaws. But she also saw her own. And most importantly, she saw that she no longer depended on that story. There had been a time when Claire would have melted at the slightest sign of his attention. But now, something had shifted. She was steadier. More centered. More willing to protect her peace than to revive a connection that no longer made sense. Robert, I understand your intentions. But my life has changed. I have changed. He frowned, maybe expecting a different response. Claire continued, this experience forced me to look inward. And what I found no longer fits with what we had. The words were liberating. Not filled with resentment, only clarity. A form of forgiveness that didn't demand a return. Robert said the boys were regretful. That Shane had been quiet, withdrawn. That Jack had cried when remembering their mother alone in Lisbon. Claire listened, moved, but not surprised. She knew distance would bring reflection. She also knew she could not carry their guilt. They need to grow on their own, she said. And so do I. The abandonment couldn't be erased, but it didn't need to be the end of the story either. Claire was rediscovering that forgiveness could coexist with the choice to move forward. And that sometimes, forgiving meant not going back, it meant simply continuing the walk. When Robert asked if he could come back another day, Claire hesitated. Maybe. But not like before. He smiled, understanding. The reunion wasn't tragic. Nor was it romantic. It was simply human. And that was enough. Claire understood then that transformation doesn't always demand dramatic cuts, but rather consistent boundaries. That emotional freedom comes when you can look at the past without wishing to rewrite it. Robert's visit didn't bring answers, it brought confirmation. The old life no longer had space in the woman she was becoming. And that was both sad and liberating. In the days that followed, Claire returned to her vineyard routine. But something in her was different. Lighter. As if, by facing Robert, she had said goodbye not only to the marriage but also to the old Claire. The one who accepted less out of fear of being alone. The one who tried to stitch together broken bonds with empty promises. Now she knew her own company was enough. That her story deserved to be told without depending on anyone else. Healing was underway. And each small choice reaffirmed her new independence, built step by step, with no shortcuts, no excuses. Penny noticed. "You're stronger now. More centered." Claire smiled. Facing the past is freeing when you know your future no longer depends on it. The silence that followed was not heavy, it was good. A silence of understanding. Of support. At 65, Claire was proving to herself that starting over doesn't require permission or youth. It only requires courage. And there, among the vineyards, surrounded by simple landscapes and real people, she was living a new chapter. A chapter where the unexpected was no longer a threat, it was possibility. The day was calm, a gentle breeze weaving through the vines, when Penny invited Claire to share a glass of wine on the terrace. It was rare to see Penny pause. She was one of those women who seemed born in motion, always busy, always practical, always fixing something. But that afternoon, there was a quietness in the air. "Sit with me, Claire," she said, pointing to a wooden chair with a view of the sunset. Claire obeyed, curious. She had no idea that this conversation would become a quiet turning point in her journey. Sometimes, listening to another is also a way of finding yourself. Penny, with a glass in hand, gazed at the horizon for a moment before she began. "You know I inherited this vineyard from my father, right?" Claire nodded. Penny continued, "But what almost no one knows is that for many years, I was only the wife of a man who told me how to live." Her tone was calm, but the words carried weight. "At 27, I thought love meant sacrifice. We met in Madrid, I fell in love quickly, and before I knew it, I had given everything up for him." Claire listened in silence, recognizing the script. How many women had lived the same story? Penny's husband, she said, had been charismatic, charming but possessive. At first, it seemed like care. Later, it became control. "He never hit me, Claire. But he erased me. Made me doubt everything I felt, everything I wanted. Until I no longer knew where he ended and I began." Claire swallowed hard. Their stories weren't identical, but the sensation was the same: the abandonment of self. The silencing of one's own desires. Penny paused, then looked Claire straight in the eyes. "It took me almost 20 years to free myself. And when I finally did, they called me crazy, ungrateful, selfish." Claire nodded. She knew those words well. But Penny didn't tell her story with bitterness. She told it with pride. "I sold the apartment, took what was mine, and came here. Everyone thought I was running away. But the truth is, it was my rebirth." Claire felt emotion rise in her chest. It was as if this conversation was revealing what she herself had been struggling to name for days. Penny's independence didn't come from the vineyard's success, it came from the courage of having chosen for herself. And there, between glasses of wine and honest confessions, Claire understood that starting over is always possible, even when everything seems lost. Penny laughed as she remembered those first months on her own. "I didn't even know where the water register was, Claire. I didn't know how to talk to suppliers. I felt like a fraud. But I learned. I fell many times. And every fall made me stronger." Claire smiled, deeply moved. Penny's vulnerability was inspiring. It showed that freedom doesn't arrive ready-made. It's built, slowly, with small choices, small gestures. That's why, when you arrived here, I saw part of myself in you, Penny said. That mix of fear and longing. The spark in your eyes of someone who doesn't yet know but is about to discover. The conversation lasted for hours. Between memories, advice, and bursts of laughter, Claire felt herself becoming stronger, more whole. Penny hadn't given her magical solutions. She had given her something far more powerful: identification. The story of resilience Claire needed to hear wasn't in a book or a motivational talk, it was right there, in front of her, flesh and blood. Penny wasn't perfect, but she was real. And that was enough. Because sometimes, all we need is to see someone who made it to the other side. Someone who stumbled, bled, but rose again. Someone who proved that abandonment isn't the end, it's only the beginning of the journey back to yourself. That night, Claire didn't write in her notebook. She simply chose to feel. She lay in bed, eyes wet, heart light. For the first time, she realized her journey wasn't an isolated case. There were thousands of women like her, who had lost themselves in roles that no longer fit. And like Penny, were being reborn slowly. Claire whispered to herself, I am not a victim. I am an unfinished version of myself. And in that phrase, she found strength. Because now, more than ever, she knew it was possible to rebuild. It was possible to begin again. And it was possible to do it at 65. It was a morning like any other at the vineyard, until Claire noticed a rental car slowly pulling up at the entrance. Her heart began racing before she even recognized the faces. Shane stepped out first, hesitant. Jack followed close behind, carrying something in his hands that looked like a backpacker, maybe a peace offering. Claire stopped in her tracks. She didn't run, didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply stood there, waiting. The scene felt surreal. The very sons who had left her behind were now standing in front of her, eyes downcast, guilt etched into their skin. The silence stretched on, heavier than any words could fill. It was Shane who finally broke it. We had to come. We had to see you. To talk to you. His voice trembled. Jack remained quiet, only nodding. Claire looked at them calmly, though inside, a storm raged. Everything she had lived since Lisbon flashed through her mind: the abandonment, the shock, the rebuilding, the rediscovery. And now, here they were, the same sons she had once nursed, protected, defended, now trying to find their way back. Claire didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to embrace them. Another part needed to understand whether they truly grasped the weight of what they had done. They sat together on a bench beneath the shade of a tree. Penny, ever discreet, quietly left them alone. Shane began to speak. We snapped, Mom. We were overwhelmed. We felt that if we kept trying to carry everything, we were going to break. Jack finally added, we didn't know how to help you without losing ourselves. Claire listened carefully to every word. It hurt, but it made sense. For years, she had filled every space. She had never allowed them to grow without her constant supervision. What she had thought of as care had, over time, turned into a cage. And hearing it from their own mouths, she felt not rage but clarity. I know we messed up badly, Shane continued. But the truth is, we didn't know how to breathe around you. We were tired, confused, and immature. Claire took a deep breath. The words were painful to hear, but necessary. This wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of boundaries that had never been respected. She saw clearly now the abandonment had been a distorted and cruel way of asking for autonomy. What once had felt unforgivable now revealed itself as a desperate plea for space. And understanding that was part of her own process of liberation and of forgiveness. Claire then spoke, her voice firm but steady. You hurt me deeply. But I also lost myself trying to be everything for you. Her son's eyes filled with tears. For the first time, they spoke not under the weight of a mother-child hierarchy, but simply as human beings, flawed, wounded, trying to reconnect. Claire explained what she had lived through in the days after the shock, the pain, the reunion with herself. She spoke of Penny, of the vineyard, of the new routine that was healing her. Her sons listened in silence, with respect. The mother they had left behind in Lisbon was no longer the same woman. And that realization touched them more deeply than any scolding or speech ever could. Jack, his voice thick with emotion, pulled a small box from his bag. "It's just a symbolic gift." Claire opened it and saw a delicate necklace with a grape-shaped pendant. "So you'll remember where you were reborn," he said. Claire smiled, moved by the gesture. It wasn't the gift itself, it was what it represented. For the first time, she felt that her sons saw her as a woman, not only as the emotional provider of the family. And that, by itself, was a giant step. The reconnection was happening, not because she begged for it, but because she had chosen herself first. And now, the bond could be rebuilt with more respect, more space, and more truth. When Penny appeared with a tray of iced tea, Claire invited her to stay. "They are part of my story. And so are you." Penny sat down, quietly observing the reunion with sensitive eyes. Claire looked at her sons and said, "Today you're welcome here. But not like before. Here, we learn to find each other without erasing ourselves." It was the clearest way to say forgiveness comes with boundaries, with a new structure, with mutual freedom. Her sons nodded. It was different. It was mature. And most importantly, it was real. For the first time, they were meeting each other as adults. That evening, they shared dinner under the stars. A simple table, a meal eaten mostly in silence, glances exchanged with more empathy than words. Claire didn't know what would come next, but she knew something had shifted. She was no longer the woman who needed validation to feel worthy. She could now choose with whom she shared her energy. The reunion with her sons wasn't a happy ending from a movie. It was an opening. An invitation to rebuild with time, with honesty, with new foundations. Because love, to be true, must come with autonomy. And at 65, Claire was finally learning how to love with space. The next morning, Claire woke up with a certainty the reunion with her sons was only the beginning of a new phase with love, yes, but also with autonomy. She prepared breakfast calmly, her movements steady, but when they sat down at the table, she was direct. "I forgive you, but am not ready to go back." The two of them stayed silent, respecting a boundary they had never heard from her before. Claire made it clear the bond needed to be rebuilt with truth and space. It was time for them to learn how to love each other without suffocating. Later that evening, over dinner, she suggested they share together. Everyone contributed. They laughed, but without trying to erase what had happened. Shane spoke about his job. Jack talked about the nephews. Claire listened, but didn't absorb responsibilities as she used to. She was present as a woman, not just as a mother. Forgiveness was coming, but it came with new limits, new contours, with a kind of love that no longer erased her newfound independence. When they walked under the starry sky that night, Claire said something simple and definitive: "You will always be my sons. But now, I also belong to myself." For the first time, they understood what that meant. She wasn't rejecting them, she was prioritizing herself. It wasn't distance. It was evolution. A new kind of relationship was being born, one with less guilt and more respect. That night, Claire slept in peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because she now knew she could love without losing herself. Forgiveness hadn't been shallow reconciliation, it was a turning point. And above all, it was a conscious choice to move forward with a light heart and her feet firmly on her own path. It was while organizing emails for Penny that Claire saw the job posting at a wine distributor in Madrid. Bilingual skills, tourism experience, strong interpersonal abilities, everything she had rediscovered in herself. Her heart skipped a beat. It was different from anything she had ever known. For the first time, an opportunity appeared not as a necessity, but as a genuine possibility for transformation. Without asking for permission, without fear, she applied. It was the first yes she had ever given entirely to herself. Penny, with her gentle wisdom, encouraged her. "You've been ready for a long time, Claire. The idea of leaving didn't hurt, it felt natural. Madrid wasn't an escape, it was an achievement. When filling out the application, Claire didn't try to appear younger or more experienced. She was simply honest. And that was enough. At that stage of her life, authenticity had become her greatest strength. Even without any guarantee of success, she already felt victorious just for trying. When the confirmation email arrived offering her the position, Claire didn't cry or scream. She simply took a deep breath. It was validation of everything she had been building since that moment of abandonment in Lisbon. At 65, someone believed in her worth, but more importantly, she believed in it too. The offer wasn't extravagant, but it was symbolic. It represented her independence in its purest form. A rebirth that didn't need anyone's blessing. She began preparing for the move with serenity. Penny helped with contacts. Her colleagues at the vineyard organized a simple but warm farewell. Claire was leaving behind a version of herself that had already bloomed. Madrid would be new soil. And now, she knew how to plant patiently and harvest with pride. A few days before the move, the phone rang. She almost didn't answer an unknown number, at an odd hour. But something made her pick it up. And when she heard the voice on the other end, her entire past rose up like a tidal wave. Robert. Her ex-husband, with that hesitant, searching tone of a man who needed shelter. Claire, I didn't know who else to call. She didn't answer immediately. She simply gripped the phone tightly, waiting for the emotions to settle enough for her to listen without drowning in them. Robert began to speak. He was in crisis. The company he had built was on the verge of collapse. He felt exhausted, lost, adrift. You always knew how to fix things. You always helped me see clearly. Claire closed her eyes. Once, those words would have sounded like an irresistible call. For decades, she had been that pillar. The one who put out everyone else's fires, managed their disasters, put her own pain aside to keep everyone standing. But now things were different. Robert kept talking, but she was no longer the woman who answered that call with open arms. Robert, I understand your pain. And I don't wish you harm. But that part of my life is over. The words came out naturally, almost tender. But the impact was clear. On the other end, silence. Claire continued, I spent too much time trying to save people who didn't want to be saved. Trying to be useful to those who didn't see me. And now that I'm finally at peace with myself, I can't go back to what I was. Not for you. Not for anyone. Robert swallowed hard. So that's it? You won't help me? Claire smiled, not with anger, but with compassion. Robert, helping myself is already hard work enough. And it's the best thing I've ever done for me. After hanging up, Claire sat at the edge of the bed with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for realizing how much of herself she had erased over the years, in the name of a love that had never been reciprocated in the right way. Relief for knowing that this time, she had chosen herself. Detachment, she now understood, wasn't cruelty. It was survival. It was clarity. It was maturity. Robert would always be part of her story, yes. But now, he was a closed chapter. With a period, not a comma. And that made her feel lighter, more whole, freer. In the days that followed, Claire reflected deeply on what that call had meant. It wasn't just about Robert. It was about everything she had once accepted in silence. About the woman who had shaped herself to fit the wounds of others, but never her own desires. By saying no to her ex-husband, she had said yes to a new version of herself. She had confirmed that her rebirth had no room for old chains. That her transformation would not depend on anyone else's pain, only on her own courage to keep growing, even when her heart wavered. Before leaving the vineyard, she wrote one last sentence in the notebook she now carried like a diary of her new life. Closing cycles is painful, but carrying what no longer fits me would be the real prison. Penny read the words and hugged her. You are ready. And Claire knew she was. Because by refusing to save those who had always drowned her, she had finally saved herself. For good. And now, with a light soul and steady gaze, she left for Madrid. Not as a woman running from the past, but as someone who had finally discharged herself from the old version of who she used to be. Madrid was not just a new city, it was the symbol of the new woman Claire had become. In her small apartment, between quiet cafes and bustling streets, she finally found something she had been searching for all her life: belonging. Not to a place but to herself. The job at the wine distributor was intense, demanding, but Claire wasn't afraid. She felt purpose. Each decision she made was free, conscious, mature. She no longer needed to please. She no longer asked for permission. This was her life, by her own choice. Her sons now respected her as a woman, not only as a mother. The old cycles had been closed with love, yes, but with boundaries. And when she received the invitation to lead the company's expansion in the United States, Claire didn't tremble. She took a deep breath and smiled. Because for the first time, she knew the choice was hers. To return or to stay. It didn't matter. She had already won. Because the true victory wasn't the destination. It was the freedom to decide the path. At 65, Claire didn't start over. She started the right way. Claire had been left in another country by her own children. Humiliated. Alone. Without a passport. Without a ground to stand on. But not without a soul. And that is why this story matters. Because she turned the key. She transformed abandonment into strength, pain into rebirth, and guilt into freedom. At 65, Claire didn't just survive, she bloomed. And she proved that it is never too late to choose yourself. Never too late to rise. Never too late to be reborn. Now it's your turn. If this story touched you, comment "Rebirth" down below and share it with someone who needs courage to begin again. And if you want more true and transformative stories like this one, subscribe to the channel and activate the notifications. Because the next turning point might be yours.